I'm glad to have you here. Follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from. My 8-year-old granddaughter looked me straight in the eye and said, "You can't sit with us. Mom says you're an old burden who smells like expired medicine." The entire table burst out laughing, including my own son. I stood up quietly and left. That night he texted asking if his mortgage payment was still coming. I replied with 2 words, "Figure it out." The next morning their panic began, but they had no idea what I'd been planning for months. Let me start from the beginning. My name is Margaret Sullivan, but everyone calls me Maggie. I'm 67 years old, a retired elementary school teacher, and apparently, according to my own family, a burden who smells like expired medicine. 3 years ago, my husband Frank died of pancreatic cancer. We'd been married for 42 years. He was my best friend, my partner, my everything. After he passed, I thought my biggest challenge would be learning to live alone. I was wrong. My biggest challenge turned out to be my own son treating me like a personal ATM machine with a beating heart attached. The afternoon of Jessica's birthday party, I stood in front of my bedroom mirror, adjusting the pearl necklace Frank had given me for our 25th anniversary. My best navy dress was freshly pressed. Call me old-fashioned, but I still believe in making an effort for family occasions, even when those occasions feel more like obligations than celebrations. I'd been making monthly payments toward David and Jessica's mortgage for 2 years. $2,000 every month transferred without fail on the first of each month. That's $48,000 if you're keeping track. I was. But did anyone ever mention that contribution at family gatherings? Of course not. I arrived at Giovanni's restaurant at exactly 6 o'clock. The hostess, a young woman with a bright smile, led me through the crowded dining room. The place was expensive, the kind of restaurant where entrees cost more than I used to spend on groceries for a week. But Jessica had insisted on celebrating her 42nd birthday here, despite the fact that my monthly contribution to their mortgage was what made such luxuries possible. The table was already full when I arrived. David sat at the head wearing a polo shirt I didn't recognize. Probably new. Jessica sat beside him in a designer dress that definitely cost more than my monthly electric bill. Their daughter, Chloe, 8 years old with her mother's sharp features, was picking at a plate of chicken nuggets. Their son, Tyler, 12, had his face buried in his phone thumbs, moving rapidly across the screen. "Mom!" David stood up and gave me one of those quick, obligatory hugs, the kind that barely makes contact. "You made it?" "Of course I made it," I said, smiling at Jessica. "It's your birthday, dear. Happy birthday." Jessica managed a tight smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Thanks, Maggie." In 15 years of marriage to my son, Jessica had never quite warmed to me. According to her, I was too involved in their lives, too opinionated, too much of everything. The irony of paying $2,000 monthly to someone who considered me too much wasn't lost on me. I settled into the chair at the far end of the table, the seat closest to the wall, the seat where conversations happened around you, not with you. "Grandma Maggie," Tyler looked up from his phone long enough to acknowledge me. "Did you see the new game I got?" "Not yet, sweetheart. You'll have to show me." And Tyler put that phone away, Jessica interrupted. "This is family time." "Family time. Right. I ordered the cheapest pasta on the menu and a water with lemon. The kind of choices you make when you're trying to stretch your Social Security check after giving away $2,000 every month. The real trouble started when Jessica's sister Karen arrived. Karen swept into the restaurant like she owned the place, her husband trailing behind her with their twin daughters. The girls were around Chloe's age, both dressed in matching outfits that probably cost more than my entire outfit, pearls included. "Jessica," Karen air-kissed her sister on both cheeks. "You look amazing. Is that the new Valentino?" "Just a little something I picked up," Jessica said, smoothing the fabric of her dress. I watched this exchange quietly. Just a little something. That dress cost at least $2,000. I knew because I'd seen the shopping bag in their house last month when I dropped off some cookies for the kids. The same month I'd transferred my usual mortgage payment. The twins immediately monopolized the conversation, talking over each other about their recent vacation to Disney World. First-class flights, the Grand Floridian Resort, private character breakfasts, special VIP tour guides. Karen kept interjecting with price tags disguised as casual mentions. "The concierge level was worth every penny of the extra $3,000, she said, sipping her wine. "Don't you think so, Jessica? You and David should really treat yourselves next year." Jessica's smile became brittle. "We're considering it." I knew they were. I'd seen the travel brochures on their kitchen counter. Lake Morrison vacation packages, luxury beach houses in Florida, all well beyond what David's construction management salary could afford even without a mortgage payment to worry about. "Girls, why don't you all sit together?" Jessica suggested brightly. "Chloe, honey, take your cousins down to that end of the table." Chloe looked at the empty chairs near me. Her face scrunched up like she'd just smelled something rotten. That's when she said it. "You can't sit with us. Mom says you're an old burden who smells like expired medicine." The words hit me like a physical blow. Around the table, Karen's family shifted uncomfortably. Someone coughed. Jessica took a long sip of her wine, her eyes fixed on her plate. And David, my own son, my only child, actually laughed. He shook his head like it was the cutest thing he'd ever heard. "Chloe, that's not very nice." But he was still grinning, still finding it amusing that his 8-year-old daughter had been coached to insult her grandmother at a public dinner. For a moment, I just sat there. The restaurant noise faded to a dull hum. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, could feel the heat rising in my face. My hands trembled slightly as I reached for my napkin. I'd spent 2 years funding their lifestyle, 2 years of sacrifice cutting back on my own expenses, rationing my blood pressure medication to make ends meet. I'd skipped dental appointments because I couldn't afford the copay after making their mortgage payment. I'd chosen between groceries and my electric bill more times than I could count. And this was how they saw me, an old burden who smelled like expired medicine. I stood up, slowly placing my napkin on the table with deliberate care. Every eye was on me now. Good. "Well," I said, my voice steady despite the trembling in my chest, "I suppose I won't burden anyone with my presence any longer." "Mom, she's just being silly," David said. But that grin was still there. That goddamn grin. "Is she—" I looked directly at him. "Or is she simply repeating what she's heard at home?" The table went quiet. Even the twins stopped chattering. Jessica's smirk faded slightly. Karen suddenly became very interested in her wine glass. David opened his mouth, closed it, then tried again. "Mom, come on. Don't make a scene." Don't make a scene. As if I was the one being unreasonable. As if I was the one who had just humiliated a family member at a public dinner. I gathered my purse, taking my time. Let them stew in the awkward silence. Let them wonder what I was thinking. "Thank you for a lovely evening," I said, my voice dripping with politeness. "Happy birthday, Jessica. I hope you enjoy the rest of your celebration." I walked out of that restaurant with my head held high and my pearls gleaming under the chandelier lights. Behind me, I could hear the murmur of conversation starting up again. They were probably already making excuses, explaining away the crazy old lady who couldn't take a joke. The drive home gave me plenty of time to think. 3 years of widowhood. 3 years of rattling around in the house that Frank and I had built together, eating dinner alone every night, waking up to an empty bed every morning. 3 years of trying to be a good mother, a good grandmother, a good person. 2 years of paying David and Jessica's mortgage because they claimed his construction business was struggling. Not just the mortgage either. There was the private school tuition for Chloe, $12,000 a year, because the public schools weren't good enough for Jessica's standards. The emergency car repair that cost $3,000. The vacation fund I'd established so the kids could have experiences. The new furniture for their living room because Jessica said the old stuff was embarrassing when she had friends over. I'd kept track of every penny. Call it a teacher's habit, but I've always been meticulous with numbers. By my calculations, I'd given them approximately $85,000 over the past 2 years. And what had it earned me? The title of old burden who smells like expired medicine. I pulled into my driveway and sat in the car for a long moment, watching the lights come on automatically in my living room. Frank had installed those timer lights before he got sick. "So you'll never come home to a dark house," he'd said. Frank would have been horrified by what happened tonight. He'd raised David to respect his elders, to value family, to understand that money wasn't everything. Somewhere along the way, those lessons had been forgotten, or maybe they'd been systematically erased by a woman who valued designer dresses and Disney vacations over basic human decency. I made myself a cup of chamomile tea and sat in Frank's old armchair. The one I'd tried to give to David 3 times, and he'd turned down every time because it didn't match their decor. I ran my hand over the worn armrest, remembering all the evenings Frank had sat here reading the newspaper, calling out interesting articles for us to discuss. My phone was on the side table face down. I knew there would be messages. David always texted after family gatherings, usually with some complaint or request. I let the tea cool while I steeled myself, then picked up the phone. 17 missed calls, 43 text messages. I scrolled through them slowly, sipping my tea. From David, "Mom, you didn't have to leave like that." From David again, "Call me back, we should talk." From Jessica, "I think there's been a misunderstanding." From David again, "Mom, this is important. Pick up." I kept scrolling. The messages got progressively more frantic, more demanding. Then at 11:15 p.m., the message that revealed everything I needed to know about our relationship. "Payment still due tomorrow. Jessica wants to confirm the transfer went through before the bank closes." I stared at that text for a long time. 2 sentences. That's what our relationship had been reduced to. No apology for his daughter's behavior, no acknowledgement of how cruel the evening had been, no concern for my feelings, just a reminder that I owed them money. I typed my response carefully, then read it 3 times before hitting send. Figure it out. Then I turned off my phone, completely finished my tea, and went to bed. I slept better that night than I had in months. Sometimes the most powerful word in the English language is simply no. The morning sun came through my bedroom window at 6:30, same as always. I'd been waking up early my whole life, first as a teacher, then as a habit I couldn't break. Frank used to joke that I was the only person he knew who got excited about sunrise. I made my coffee the good stuff Sumatran dark roast that I usually saved for special occasions, and sat down at my kitchen table with my phone. Still off. I turned it on slowly, watching the screen light up. The notifications came flooding in. 57 new messages now, 23 missed calls, 3 voicemails. I took a long sip of my coffee and started reading. The messages from last night had been frantic. This morning's messages were panicked. "Mom, please call back," from David at 6:47 a.m. "There's been a misunderstanding. Can we talk?" from Jessica at 7:02 a.m. "Grandma, I'm sorry, I didn't mean it." From Chloe's phone, but obviously typed by Jessica. Chloe was 8. She didn't text in complete sentences with proper punctuation. I made myself toast with strawberry jam homemade from the berries in my garden and kept reading. The mortgage payment was due by 3 p.m. today. Without my $2,000 contribution, they were $800 short. I knew this because I'd been quietly reviewing their finances for months. Not snooping exactly, just paying attention. David had a habit of leaving bank statements on the kitchen counter when I visited. Jessica kept her shopping receipts in a bowl by the front door. I'd developed a pretty clear picture of their spending habits. David made good money as a construction manager, $75,000 a year plus bonuses. Jessica worked part-time at a boutique marketing firm, bringing in another $30,000. Combined annual income of $105,000. Their mortgage payment was $2,800 a month. With my $2,000, they only needed to come up with $800 themselves. That left them with over $7,000 a month for everything else. So where was all that money going? Designer clothes, expensive restaurants, private school, premium cable packages, new cars every 3 years. A lifestyle carefully calculated to impress Jessica's sister and their country club friends. They didn't need my money. They wanted my money. There's a difference. At 9:15, my doorbell rang. Through the window, I could see David's pickup truck in my driveway. He was standing on my front porch, wearing jeans and a wrinkled t-shirt, looking exactly like he had when he was 16 and trying to explain why he'd dented my car. I took my time getting to the door. Let him wait. Let him think about what he was going to say. "Morning, sweetheart," I said brightly, opening the door with a smile. "You're up early." "Mom," he pushed past me into my living room without being invited. "What's going on? You didn't send the mortgage payment." "No," I agreed pleasantly. "I didn't." He stared at me like I'd just spoken in a foreign language. "The payment is due today. You know that. You've been making it for 2 years. "I have indeed." I closed the door and walked to my armchair, Frank's chair, and sat down. 24 payments to be exact. $48,000. I'd done the math last night before bed. Seeing his face when I said the number out loud was deeply satisfying. "We've been over this," he said, frustration creeping into his voice. "The business has been slow. We needed help getting through a rough patch." "Has it really?" I folded my hands in my lap. The business has been slow for 2 whole years, because Jessica seemed quite confident last night when she called me a burden. People who burden others rarely deserve continued generosity. David's face flushed red. "She didn't mean it that way." "Oh, I think she meant it exactly that way. And I think you agreed with her considering how entertaining you found Chloe's little performance. Look, Mom. He ran his hand through his hair. We can discuss this later. Right now I need you to call the bank and make the transfer. The payment is due at 3. The sheer audacity left me speechless for a moment. No apology, no acknowledgement of wrongdoing, no recognition that last night had been humiliating and cruel, just a demand that I continue funding their lifestyle despite being publicly insulted. David, I said slowly, carefully, I'm going to say this once, so listen carefully. I will never make another mortgage payment for you. Not today, not tomorrow, not ever. His mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. You can't be serious. Completely serious. In fact, I'm curious how you plan to make the payment today. I called the bank yesterday afternoon and told them there would be no transfer today or any day moving forward. The color drained from his face as the reality hit him. Without my monthly payment, they couldn't afford their mortgage. Without their house, they couldn't maintain the lifestyle Jessica demanded. The carefully constructed house of cards was about to collapse. We'll lose the house, he said quietly. Then perhaps you should have thought about that before allowing your daughter to insult me in public. Before you laughed at my humiliation like it was the funniest thing you'd ever seen. I stood up, signaling that our conversation was over. I have garden club at 11. You'll need to figure this out on your own. Mom, please. His voice cracked slightly. We can work something out. Jessica can apologize. We can all sit down and talk about this. Jessica has had 2 years to show me respect. Instead, she chose to teach my granddaughter that I'm a burden. That ship has sailed David. He tried everything then. Pleading, bargaining, even veiled threats about how I'd regret this decision, how I was destroying our family over one stupid comment. But I'd made up my mind. Some decisions once made are final. After he left slamming the door hard enough to rattle the pictures on my wall, I called my financial advisor. Martha Whitmore had been handling my investments since Frank died. She was a sharp woman in her 50s who didn't take nonsense from anyone. Maggie, she said warmly when she picked up, how lovely to hear from you. What can I do for you today? I need to schedule an appointment, I said. I'm closing the Bank of Maggie permanently, and I need to figure out what to do with all the money I've been throwing away. There was a brief pause. Then, well, hallelujah. I've been waiting for this call for 2 years. We scheduled a meeting for the next day. I spent the rest of the morning in my garden pulling weeds and deadheading my roses. Frank had always said I had magic hands when it came to growing things. The garden was my sanctuary, the place where I could think clearly. My prize-winning roses were in full bloom, deep red petals soft as velvet. I'd won the county fair's best rose competition 3 years running. These roses had been here when Frank was alive, had survived harsh winters and scorching summers. They were stronger than they looked. Kind of like me, I realized. The afternoon brought Jessica to my door. She was crying when I opened it, mascara running down her cheeks, her designer dress replaced with yoga pants and an oversized sweater. She looked young and scared and genuinely distressed. Almost made me feel sorry for her. Almost. Maggie, please, she said, her voice breaking. Can we talk? I considered closing the door in her face, considered telling her exactly what I thought of her and her materialistic values and her cruel treatment of the woman who'd been subsidizing her lifestyle. Instead, I stepped aside and let her in. Would you like some tea? I asked, leading her to the kitchen. She nodded, sniffling. I put the kettle on and got out my good china, the set my mother had given me when I got married. I'd never used it for David and Jessica before. They were paper plate people, even at their own home. I poured the tea and sat across from her at my small kitchen table. The same table where Frank and I had eaten thousands of meals together. Where we'd done homework with David when he was little. Where we'd planned our future and dreamed our dreams. I'm sorry, Jessica said, wrapping her hands around the teacup. I'm so sorry about what Chloe said. I never told her to say that. I sipped my tea and said nothing, let her fill the silence. Okay, I might have said something like that, but I didn't mean for her to repeat it, especially not in public like that. But you did say it, I said quietly. You taught an 8-year-old child that her grandmother is a burden. That's what you believe. No, I was frustrated. Karen is always bragging about their vacations and their house and their cars. She makes me feel like we're not successful enough, like we're not doing enough for our kids. So you take money from me and then complain that I'm a burden? Jessica flinched. When you put it that way, is there another way to put it? She was crying harder now, real tears that I suspected were more about losing my financial support than any genuine remorse. We need that mortgage payment, Maggie. We're going to lose the house. Then perhaps you should spend less on designer clothes and expensive restaurants. Perhaps you should live within your means instead of trying to impress people who don't actually care about you. That's not fair. Isn't it? I set down my teacup with a soft click. Jessica, I've watched you for 15 years. You've never been happy with what you have. It's always about the next thing, the better thing, the thing that will make Karen jealous or impress your friends. And you've taught my granddaughter those same values. I'm trying to give my children a good life. A good life isn't measured by how expensive your clothes are or where you vacation. A good life is measured by how you treat people, by your character, by your values. And right now those things are severely lacking. She stood up, her tears replaced by anger. So that's it. You're going to let us lose our house because of one mistake. I'm not letting you do anything. I'm simply refusing to continue enabling your poor choices. You and David earn more than enough money to afford that mortgage without my help. You just don't want to give up your luxuries to do it. You're punishing us. No, Jessica. I'm teaching you the same lesson I tried to teach David when he was growing up. Actions have consequences. You wanted to treat me like a burden. Fine. Burdens can be set down. She left crying, slamming my door just like David had. I washed the teacups by hand, taking my time, and put them back in the china cabinet. Somehow using the good china had made that conversation feel more civilized, more final. That evening, Tyler called. My heart hurt when I saw his name on the caller ID. Tyler was a good kid caught in the middle of his parents' mess. He didn't deserve any of this. Grandma Maggie? His voice was small and certain. Hi, sweetheart. How are you? Mom said we might have to move if you don't help with the house payment. Is that true? I closed my eyes, feeling the weight of this conversation. How do you explain adult conflicts to a 12-year-old without making him feel responsible? Your mother is correct that things might change for your family. But Tyler, that's not your problem to worry about. That's your parents' job to figure out. But you can fix it, right? You always fix everything. The faith in his voice nearly broke my resolve. Nearly. Sometimes sweetie people have to fix their own problems. Your parents are adults. They'll figure it out. Are you mad at us? He asked quietly. Oh, honey, no. I'm not mad at you or Chloe. I love you both very much. Then why won't you help? Because sometimes the most loving thing you can do is let people face the consequences of their choices. Do you understand? Not really, he admitted. That's okay. You will someday. After I hung up, I sat in Frank's chair and looked at the family photos on my wall. David as a baby, David's first day of school, David's high school graduation, David's wedding day. Somewhere between those photos, I'd lost my son. Or maybe he'd lost himself. Either way, the man who'd laughed at my humiliation last night wasn't the boy I'd raised. But Tyler and Chloe, they still had a chance. They could still learn that people matter more than possessions, that kindness matters more than status, that family is built on respect, not money. Even if their parents never learned those lessons, maybe I could still teach them to my grandchildren. I just had to survive what was coming next. 31 days later, the foreclosure notice appeared on David and Jessica's door. I know because Tyler texted me a photo of it. The image showed an official-looking document taped to their front door, all legal language in bold red letters. Underneath, Tyler had written, "Grandma, are you really going to let us become homeless?" I was sitting in my garden when the text arrived, enjoying the morning sun and the sight of my roses in their full glory. I'd just finished weeding around the rose bushes, my hands still dirty from the soil. Frank had always said I had magic hands when it came to growing things. The notice gave them 90 days to bring their mortgage current, or face eviction. 3 months to figure out what they should have been handling all along. But instead of using that time wisely, they launched what I came to think of as the campaign to break Grandma. It started with the guilt trips. Jessica left voicemails sobbing about how the children would suffer. "Chloe cries herself to sleep every night," she wailed in one message. "She's terrified we're going to be living in our car. How can you do this to your own grandchildren?" Never mind that Chloe had seemed perfectly happy when I'd seen her at school pickup last week, laughing with her friends without a care in the world. David showed up unannounced with emergencies that always seemed to happen right around dinner time. A leak in the basement, which turned out to be condensation. A problem with the furnace, which was actually just a dirty filter. Each visit was an opportunity to mention how stressed Jessica was, how the kids were falling behind in school, how their whole world was falling apart. All because you can't forgive one little comment, he'd say, shaking his head like I was being unreasonable. One little comment, as if cruelty became acceptable if it was brief. Even my neighbor got recruited to their cause. Mrs. Henderson from next door stopped by one afternoon with a concerned expression and a plate of cookies I knew she'd bought from the grocery store. "Maggie, dear," she said, settling into my living room with her store-bought cookies. "I've been hearing some troubling things about your family situation." "Have you now?" I poured us both iced tea, taking my time. "David stopped by yesterday. He's very worried about you." She leaned forward conspiratorially. "He thinks you might be having some memory issues, making decisions that aren't quite like you." I had to laugh at that. "Memory issues, is that what he told you?" "Well, he mentioned that you've suddenly stopped helping with their mortgage, and that's so unlike you, Maggie. You've always been so generous with family." "Mrs. Henderson," I said carefully, "has it occurred to you that my generosity might have been taken advantage of? That perhaps stopping the money isn't a sign of memory problems, but of clarity?" She blinked at me cookie halfway to her mouth. "My son and daughter-in-law earn a combined income of over $100,000 a year. They chose a house they couldn't afford and asked me to subsidize their poor decision. I did so for 2 years, during which time they showed me no gratitude, no respect, and ultimately taught their 8-year-old daughter to call me an old burden." I took a sip of my tea and smiled. "I'm not having memory problems, Margaret. I'm having a moment of perfect clarity." Mrs. Henderson left shortly after that, taking her store-bought cookies with her. The second week brought escalation. Chloe's teacher called to express concern about the child's emotional state. Ms. Rodriguez was a nice young woman, probably in her late 20s, fresh-faced and earnest. "Mrs. Sullivan, I wanted to reach out because Chloe has been telling some concerning stories at school." "What kind of stories?" I asked, though I could already guess. "She's been saying that her grandmother is making her family homeless, that you're being mean because she accidentally said something that hurt your feelings. The other children are starting to ask questions, and Chloe seems quite distressed." Accidentally. That word did a lot of heavy lifting. "Ms. Rodriguez," I said carefully, "I appreciate your concern for Chloe, but I want to make sure you have the full picture. Chloe's parents earn more than enough money to support their family. They've chosen to live beyond their means and are now facing the consequences of that choice. I'm not making anyone homeless. I'm simply refusing to continue subsidizing a lifestyle they can't afford." There was a pause on the line. I wasn't aware of the financial details, of course. I just wanted to make sure Chloe had support during this difficult time. "Chloe has support," I assured her. "She has 2 parents who are capable of making better financial decisions. She has a grandmother who loves her very much but won't enable her parents' irresponsibility, and she has a teacher who clearly cares about her well-being. She'll be fine." But Ms. Rodriguez's call had rattled me more than I wanted to admit. They were using Chloe as a weapon now, turning an 8-year-old child into an emotional battering ram to break down my resolve. The third week brought my sister Patricia into the mix. Patricia lived in Seattle and only called twice a year Christmas and her birthday when she wanted to make sure her gift was on the way. This call was neither. "Maggie, what on earth is going on?" she demanded without preamble. "David called me yesterday in tears. He says you're letting them lose their house over some silly argument at dinner." "Hello to you too, Patricia." "I'm well, thank you for asking." She huffed impatiently. "This isn't the time for sarcasm. Your son is about to lose his home and you're sitting there doing nothing. Frank would be horrified." That stung. Using Frank against me was a low blow even for Patricia. "Frank," I said, my voice hardening, "would be horrified by a grandson who lets his 8-year-old daughter insult her grandmother and finds it amusing. Frank believed in respect, Patricia. You might try remembering that." "Oh, for God's sake. Children say thoughtless things all the time. You can't punish an entire family for one child's comment." "I'm not punishing anyone. I'm simply refusing to continue enabling financial irresponsibility." "You're being selfish and stubborn." "I'm being clear-eyed and boundaried. There's a difference." Patricia hung up on me. We wouldn't speak again for another year, probably. I was okay with that. But the real surprise came during week 4. I was in my garden pruning my roses and enjoying the late afternoon sun when my phone rang. Unknown number. Mrs. Sullivan, this is Robert Martinez from Martinez and Associates. I'm an attorney representing your son David Sullivan in a legal matter concerning you. I nearly dropped my pruning shears. I beg your pardon. Your son is filing for conservatorship, claiming you're no longer capable of making sound financial decisions. He's provided evidence of erratic behavior and poor judgment that suggests diminished mental capacity. The audacity was breathtaking. David was actually trying to have me declared incompetent so he could control my money and force me to resume mortgage payments. My own son was attempting to steal my financial independence because I dared to say no. Mr. Martinez, I said, my voice steady despite my racing heart. I believe there's been a misunderstanding. My mental capacity is perfectly intact. In fact, it's clearer now than it's been in years. Ma'am, I'm simply calling as a courtesy to inform you of the proceedings. You'll need legal representation. The initial hearing is scheduled for Mr. Martinez. May I ask you something? Of course. Do you have parents? There was a surprised pause. Yes, ma'am. My mother is 72. And if your mother decided to stop giving you money, would you have her declared incompetent? Another pause longer this time. That's not really relevant to... It's absolutely relevant. You're being used as a tool to financially abuse an elderly woman. I hope you're comfortable with that. I hung up before he could respond. Then I sat in Frank's chair and laughed until tears ran down my face. David had just made the biggest mistake of his life. He'd escalated this from a simple financial boundary to a full-scale war, and he had no idea who he was fighting. I'd spent 40 years managing classrooms full of unruly children. I'd balanced family finances through 3 recessions. I'd nursed a stubborn husband through cancer without losing my mind once. I'd raised David himself, though clearly I'd made some mistakes there. But I'd learned from those mistakes. And I was about to teach my son exactly what happens when you underestimate a grandmother who's finally had enough. The next morning, I called Harrison Blackwood and Associates, the most respected family law firm in the city. They didn't just handle conservatorship disputes. They specialized in protecting elderly clients from financial abuse by family members. Sarah Blackwood met me in her corner office the following Tuesday. She was a woman in her late 40s with steel gray hair pulled back in a neat bun and eyes that missed nothing. Mrs. Sullivan, she said, shaking my hand firmly, I've reviewed your son's petition. Tell me your side of the story. I laid it all out. Every detail. The 2 years of mortgage payments. The $85,000 total. The birthday dinner humiliation. The old burden comment. David's laughter. The subsequent cutting off of funds. The campaign of guilt and manipulation. Sarah listened without interrupting, taking notes on a yellow legal pad. When I finished, she leaned back in her chair and smiled. It wasn't entirely pleasant. Mrs. Sullivan, what you're describing is unfortunately very common. Adult children who feel entitled to their parents' money often resort to legal intimidation when the money stops flowing. Can he actually have me declared incompetent? I asked. He can try, but he'll need medical evidence. Multiple professional evaluations, proof of genuine mental decline. She gestured at her notes. From our conversation today, you're clearly competent. In fact, stopping payments to an ungrateful family shows excellent judgment. So what can we do? Sarah's smile widened. We defend you vigorously. And then, Mrs. Sullivan, we go on the offensive. Financial elder abuse is a crime in this state. If your son has been manipulating you for money while allowing his family to mistreat you, we can pursue charges. I don't want to see him in prison, I said quickly. Maybe not, but the threat of prosecution tends to resolve these situations very quickly. Once your son realizes he's not dealing with a helpless old woman, but someone with serious legal backing, he'll likely back down. We spent the next 2 hours going over strategy. I would need medical evaluations to prove my competence, financial records to show the pattern of payments and my sound management of my own affairs, character witnesses who could testify to my mental acuity. There's one more thing, I said as we wrapped up. I hired a private investigator 2 months before I cut off the payments. Sarah's eyebrows rose. Did you know? I pulled out a folder I'd been carrying in my purse. I was starting to suspect something was wrong with how they were using my money. I wanted proof before I confronted them. The investigator's report was thorough. Photographs of Jessica's shopping trips to expensive boutiques. Credit card statements showing payments to luxury resorts and high-end restaurants. Bank records proving that my mortgage payments weren't going to the mortgage at all. David and Jessica were using their own income for that, and diverting my money to fund their lifestyle. Sarah flipped through the pages, her smile growing wider with each one. Mrs. Sullivan, you're not the confused old woman your son thinks you are. You're a strategic thinker who documented everything before making a move. I was a teacher for 40 years, I said. I learned to anticipate problems and gather evidence. Well, your son is about to learn that he picked a fight with the wrong woman. As I drove home from the lawyer's office, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Anticipation. Excitement, even. David wanted to play hardball perfect. He was about to discover that grandmothers don't become doormats when they age. Sometimes they just get more strategic about when and how they fight back. The court hearing was scheduled for a Thursday morning in late September, exactly 6 weeks after I'd cut off David's mortgage payments. I arrived early wearing my best charcoal gray suit, the one I'd bought for Frank's funeral, but had never worn since. It felt appropriate somehow. I was burying the old Maggie today, the one who'd let herself be used and disrespected. In her place would stand someone stronger. Sarah Blackwood met me in the courthouse lobby at 8:30. She carried a leather briefcase that looked expensive and well used, the kind that spoke of hundreds of cases won. "Ready?" she asked, her eyes sharp and assessing. "As I'll ever be. Remember what we discussed. Answer questions directly. Don't elaborate unless asked. Let the evidence speak for itself." I nodded, my mouth dry despite the bottle of water I'd been sipping all morning. The courtroom was smaller than I'd expected. Wood-paneled walls, fluorescent lighting, rows of benches that reminded me uncomfortably of church pews. David sat on the opposite side with Jessica and a young lawyer who looked barely old enough to shave. The lawyer wore an ill-fitting suit and kept adjusting his tie nervously. Jessica wore a conservative dress I'd never seen before, probably bought specifically for this hearing. Her usual designer labels were notably absent, playing the struggling daughter-in-law role to perfection. When David's eyes met mine across the aisle, I saw something I'd never seen in my son's face before: calculation. Cold, hard calculation. This wasn't about family anymore. This was about money and control. The realization hurt less than I'd expected. Maybe I'd already grieved for the son I'd raised. This stranger in the courtroom was someone else entirely. All rise for the Honorable Patricia Wells. Judge Wells was a woman in her 50s with silver hair pulled back in a neat bun and eyes that reminded me of my third-grade teacher, the kind that could spot a lie from across the room. She settled into her chair and reviewed the papers in front of her with careful attention. "We're here today regarding a petition for conservatorship filed by David Sullivan concerning his mother, Margaret Sullivan." She looked up, her gaze moving between both sides of the courtroom. "This is a serious matter. Conservatorship removes fundamental rights from an individual. I don't take these petitions lightly." David's lawyer stood up, smoothing his tie one more time. "Your Honor, if I may present our case." For the next 20 minutes, I listened to a stranger describe me as a tragic figure in decline. According to David's lawyer, I'd become erratic and irrational following my husband's death. My sudden cessation of mortgage payments after 2 years of reliable contributions demonstrated impaired judgment. My irrational hostility toward my loving family suggested cognitive decline. The lawyer painted a picture of a confused elderly woman who needed protection from her own poor decisions. A woman whose generous, loving nature had been twisted by grief and age into something bitter and unreasonable. Mrs. Sullivan's behavior represents a dramatic departure from years of generous, loving support, the young lawyer said earnestly. This sudden change suggests cognitive decline that requires professional intervention. My client seeks only to protect his mother from herself and ensure her financial security. I kept my face neutral, but inside I was seething. According to this narrative, sanity was defined as unlimited financial generosity. Setting boundaries was evidence of mental illness. When it was Sarah's turn, she stood with the kind of quiet confidence that comes from knowing you hold all the cards. "Your Honor, Mrs. Sullivan is here today because she committed the apparently unforgivable sin of saying no to adult children who felt entitled to her money." Sarah's voice carried clearly through the courtroom. "This isn't a case of diminished capacity. It's a case of enhanced clarity." She opened her briefcase and pulled out a thick folder. "I'd like to present Mrs. Sullivan's medical records from the past 6 months. Blood pressure 120/75, excellent for her age. Cognitive function tests administered by Dr. Richard Hernandez, a neurologist, perfect scores across all metrics. Dr. Hernandez's written opinion states, and I quote, Margaret Sullivan demonstrates remarkable mental acuity for a woman of any age, let alone 67. Her memory, reasoning, and decision-making abilities are well within normal range and show no signs of cognitive decline. Sarah placed the medical records on the judge's bench and returned to her table. Now let's discuss why Mr. Sullivan is really here. She pulled out another folder, my financial records. Over the past 2 years, Mrs. Sullivan has given her son and daughter-in-law approximately $85,000, not loans, gifts, money she could have used for her own medical care, her own comfort, her own security. She spread bank statements across the table, each one highlighted to show the transfers. Mrs. Sullivan didn't stop thinking clearly, Your Honor. She started thinking clearly. She realized she was being taken advantage of by family members who showed her no respect, no gratitude, and ultimately taught their 8-year-old daughter to publicly humiliate her grandmother. Jessica shifted uncomfortably in her seat. David stared straight ahead, jaw clenched. Sarah pulled out one more document, the private investigator's report. 2 months before Mrs. Sullivan ceased payments, she hired a private investigator because she suspected her money wasn't being used as claimed. The investigation revealed that her monthly mortgage payments weren't going toward the mortgage at all. Mr. and Mrs. Sullivan were using their own income, a combined $105,000 annually, to pay their mortgage. They were diverting Mrs. Sullivan's money to fund a lifestyle they couldn't otherwise afford. She placed photographs on the judge's bench. Jessica shopping at Nordstrom, David's new pickup truck, restaurant receipts from places where entrees cost more than I spent on groceries in a week. This isn't about an elderly woman losing her mental capacity, Your Honor. This is about an elderly woman who did her homework, discovered she was being defrauded, and had the courage to stop it. Judge Wells studied the photographs, her expression unreadable. Mrs. Sullivan, she said, looking directly at me. Would you like to say anything? I stood up slowly, my legs shaking slightly. Sarah had told me I didn't have to testify, but I wanted to. I needed to. Your Honor, I raised my son to value honesty, respect, and family. Somewhere along the way, he forgot those lessons. Or maybe his wife convinced him to forget them. I looked directly at David. I loved you enough to support you when you said you needed help. I loved you enough to sacrifice my own comfort to ensure your children had opportunities. But I love myself enough to recognize when that love is being exploited. My voice didn't shake. I was proud of that. I stopped making payments because I learned the money wasn't being used as I was told. I stopped making payments because my granddaughter called me an old burden and her parents laughed. I stopped making payments because I realized I was funding a lifestyle built on disrespect and deception. I paused. That's not mental decline, Your Honor. That's self-respect. Judge Wells made notes on her legal pad. The courtroom was so quiet I could hear the clock ticking on the wall. Then Sarah played her trump card. Your Honor, there's one more piece of evidence I'd like to present. Mrs. Sullivan began recording conversations with her son after he threatened to have her declared incompetent. These recordings were made legally in her own home with single-party consent as allowed under state law. She pulled out a small digital recorder and a transcript. I'd like to play 2 brief recordings. Judge Wells nodded. The first recording was David's voice demanding money and threatening legal action when I refused. His tone was cold, transactional. You owe us this money, Mom. We planned our budget around your contributions. You can't just pull the rug out from under us. My voice on the recording was calm, measured. I don't owe you anything, David. I chose to help when you said you needed it. I'm choosing to stop now that I know the truth. Then you leave me no choice. I'll have to take legal action to protect your assets from your own bad judgment. The second recording was even more damning. Jessica's voice talking to someone on speakerphone while I was supposedly out of the room. I'd actually been in the hallway, having forgotten my purse. Once we get the conservatorship established, we'll have access to everything, Jessica said, her voice bright with anticipation. David says his mom probably has at least $300,000 in savings. We can use that to pay off the house, maybe get the vacation home in Lake Morrison we've been looking at. The friend's voice on the other end. But won't there be oversight? Someone watching how you spend her money? Jessica laughed. Please, David will be the conservator. He can justify anything as being for her care. We just need to squeeze the old bat for a few years, and then when she's really gone, we'll inherit the rest anyway. The courtroom fell absolutely silent. Even David's lawyer looked uncomfortable. Judge Wells' expression had gone from neutral to thunderous. Mr. Sullivan, she said, her voice cutting through the silence like a blade. Do you have anything to say about these recordings? David looked like a man who just realized he was standing in quicksand. He glanced at his lawyer, who shook his head slightly, a clear message not to speak. Your Honor, David's lawyer said, standing quickly, those conversations were taken out of context. Out of context. Judge Wells leaned forward. What context makes it appropriate to refer to your mother as the old bat while discussing strategies to access her money? No answer, because there wasn't one. Judge Wells reviewed her notes for what felt like an eternity. Then she looked up, her decision clear in her eyes. This petition for conservatorship is denied. The gavel came down with a sharp crack. Furthermore, I'm referring this case to the District Attorney's Office for investigation of potential elder financial abuse under State Statute 368. This court is adjourned. The gavel fell again, and it was over. David sat frozen in his seat. Jessica had gone pale. Their lawyer was already packing up his briefcase, probably eager to distance himself from this disaster. Sarah touched my arm gently. Let's go. We walked out of the courtroom together, leaving David and Jessica to face the reality of what they'd done. Outside on the courthouse steps, the September sun felt warm on my face. I took a deep breath, feeling lighter than I had in years. What happens now? I asked Sarah. Now the DA investigates. They'll interview you, review the evidence, determine if there's enough for criminal charges. She smiled. But regardless of whether they prosecute your son and daughter-in-law, now understand that you're not the helpless old woman they thought you were. They underestimated you badly. Sarah, thank you for everything. Thank me by living your best life, Mrs. Sullivan. Stop letting people who don't respect you control your happiness. As I drove home, my phone buzzed with a text from Tyler. Grandma, Mom, and Dad are really upset. Can we come over and talk? I pulled over to respond. Not today, sweetheart, but I love you very much. That will never change. 3 dots appeared, then disappeared, then appeared again. Finally, I love you too. That evening I sat in my garden with a glass of wine, the good stuff, a bottle of Pinot Noir I'd been saving for a special occasion. Winning in court felt pretty special. The roses were blooming beautifully, their perfume carrying on the evening breeze. Frank would have loved this moment. He'd always said I had more backbone than I gave myself credit for. I'm starting to believe you, honey, I said to the empty garden. But something told me David and Jessica weren't finished yet. Desperate people do desperate things, and I'd just made them very desperate indeed. I was right to be cautious. 3 weeks after the court hearing, I woke up at 6 a.m. to my phone ringing. It was my neighbor, Mrs. Henderson. Maggie, there's a U-Haul truck in David's driveway. They're loading furniture. I stood at my bedroom window looking out at the street. Sure enough, a large moving truck sat in front of David and Jessica's house. Even from here, I could see people carrying boxes and furniture, moving with the frantic energy of people running from something. My phone rang again. David this time. I considered not answering, but curiosity got the better of me. Mom? His voice had that fake cheerfulness he'd used since childhood when trying to cover up trouble. I wanted you to hear this from me first. We're moving. I can see that. Where are you going? Phoenix. Jessica's sister has a house there, and I can get construction work. Better opportunities than here. Better opportunities. The lie was so transparent, it was almost insulting. How wonderful for you all. I'm sure the children must be excited about the adventure. About that, Mom. His voice shifted, became more wheedling. The kids are going to stay with you. I nearly dropped the phone. Excuse me? Just temporarily until we get settled and find a place with good schools. Jessica thinks it would be easier if they stayed in familiar surroundings for now. You know, less disruptive. The sheer audacity left me momentarily speechless. They were abandoning their children and expecting me to provide free childcare while they escaped the financial mess they'd created. David, I said slowly, let me make sure I understand this correctly. You're moving to Phoenix, leaving Tyler and Chloe behind and assuming I'll take care of them. It's not abandoning them, Mom. It's just practical. They can finish the school year here, and then we'll reassess. And who precisely asked me if I was willing to become a full-time guardian to 2 children? Silence on the other end. Because of course nobody had asked me. They'd simply assumed that good old Grandma Maggie would step up and solve another problem they'd created. The thing is, David, I continued, my voice hardening, we already told the kids. They're excited to spend time with Grandma. You don't want to disappoint them, do you? The manipulation was impressive, I had to admit. Turn it around, make it my fault if the children were hurt. Through my window, I could see Tyler and Chloe sitting on their front steps. They weren't excited. They looked terrified. David, you will not dump your children on me because you've made poor financial decisions. Mom, please. We don't have any other options. You have plenty of options. You can take responsibility for your children like adults do. You can take them with you to Phoenix. You can find local employment instead of running away. What you cannot do is make your problems my responsibility. But the kids need stability. They need parents who don't abandon them when life gets difficult. I hung up before he could respond. An hour later, Jessica knocked on my door. She'd clearly been crying, and her usual polished appearance was nowhere in evidence. She wore jeans and an old sweatshirt, her hair pulled back in a messy ponytail. Maggie, please don't make this harder than it already is. I'm not making anything hard. You and David created this situation entirely on your own. We have to leave today. Her voice cracked. David owes money to some contractors who are threatening to sue. We can't take the kids right now because we'll be sleeping on my sister's couch until David finds work. Finally, the truth. They weren't moving for better opportunities. They were fleeing creditors, probably using their money problems as an excuse to abandon parenting responsibilities they'd never wanted in the first place. Jessica, I'm going to say this once and very clearly. I will not take custody of Tyler and Chloe. I will not become their guardian. I will not solve this problem for you. Then what are we supposed to do? She was crying harder now, mascara running down her face. Take them with you. Accept your sister's help for all 4 of you instead of just 2. Be parents. You're really going to let your own grandchildren become homeless. The manipulation playbook again. Turn abandonment into homelessness. Make it my fault instead of theirs. Appeal to emotions rather than logic. I'm not making anyone homeless. You are making the choice to leave your children behind, and I am making the choice not to enable that decision. Jessica left sobbing, but the packing continued. At noon, I made a decision that would change everything. I called Child Protective Services. I'd like to report a situation involving 2 minors who are about to be abandoned by their parents. The caseworker who answered listened carefully as I explained the situation. David and Jessica were leaving for Phoenix within hours. They had no stable housing arrangement and were attempting to leave their children behind without proper legal guardianship in place. We'll send someone right away, the caseworker said. 2 social workers arrived within an hour just as David and Jessica were loading the last boxes into their truck. I watched from my living room window as official paperwork was served and serious conversations were held on the sidewalk. Tyler and Chloe sat on the curb, small suitcases at their feet, looking lost and confused. My heart broke for them, but I wouldn't enable their parents' irresponsibility. One of the social workers knocked on my door at 4 o'clock. She was a woman in her 40s with kind eyes and a professional demeanor. Mrs. Sullivan, I'm Maria Santos from Child Protective Services. Your son and daughter-in-law indicated you might be willing to provide temporary care for the children while they relocate. I'm afraid they were mistaken. I've made it clear that I cannot take on that responsibility. Maria nodded understandingly. We have a very good emergency placement family who can take both children tonight. The Morrisons have been foster parents for 8 years. They'll remain in the same school district and will work on permanent arrangements once your son establishes residency in Arizona. Through the window, I could see David and Jessica arguing furiously beside their loaded truck. Jessica was gesturing wildly, pointing in my direction. David's face was red with anger. Will the children be safe? I asked quietly. Absolutely. The Morrisons are excellent caregivers. Tyler and Chloe will be well cared for. I watched as Maria returned to the sidewalk and continued her conversation with David and Jessica. Whatever she said made Jessica's face crumble. David looked like he wanted to punch something. The final outcome took 3 hours to resolve. David and Jessica could leave for Phoenix if they chose, but Tyler and Chloe would be placed in emergency foster care unless suitable family arrangements could be made immediately. Since I'd declined, and there were no other family members within reasonable distance, the children would go with the Morrisons. At 7 o'clock, David and Jessica drove away from their children without a backward glance. Tyler and Chloe climbed into Maria's car with their small suitcases heading to a home with strangers because their parents had chosen to abandon them. As I watched them drive away, Chloe turned and looked at my house. Her 8-year-old face was streaked with tears, and for a moment our eyes met through the window. My resolve almost broke. Almost. But I'd learned something important over these past few months. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to enable destructive behavior, even when the consequences hurt everyone involved. David and Jessica had shown their true character when faced with real adversity. They were willing to abandon their own children to escape financial problems. If I'd taken Tyler and Chloe in, what lesson would that have taught? That someone would always clean up their messes, that parental responsibility was optional. No, some lessons have to be learned the hard way. That night I sat in my garden with a heavy heart, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and crimson. The roses bloomed beautifully, their perfume carrying on the evening breeze like a promise that even the most difficult decisions can lead to unexpected growth. But I had a feeling this story was far from over. 2 months later, I learned that David and Jessica had never made it to Phoenix. They'd been arrested in Las Vegas with a car full of stolen construction equipment. The news came from Maria Santos during one of her regular check-ins about Tyler and Chloe. She sat in my living room accepting coffee while reviewing paperwork that seemed to grow thicker with each visit. "Mrs. Sullivan, I have some updates about your son and daughter-in-law's situation." Her tone was carefully professional, but I caught the hint of satisfaction underneath. "Please tell me they're not trying to drag those children into whatever mess they've created now." "Actually, quite the opposite." Maria pulled out a legal document. "They've been charged with theft, receiving stolen goods, and interstate transport of stolen property. They're looking at serious prison time." I set down my coffee cup carefully, my hand surprisingly steady. "How serious? 3 to 5 years minimum, possibly longer if they can't make restitution to the victims." She paused. "They've also formally relinquished their parental rights." The words hit me like a physical blow. "They what it?" "Yesterday afternoon they signed papers surrendering all legal rights to Tyler and Chloe. The children are now wards of the state, pending permanent placement." I stared out my kitchen window, watching Mrs. Henderson water her garden next door. Everything looked so normal, so peaceful, while my family had completely imploded just a few miles away in a Las Vegas jail. "What does this mean for the children?" I asked quietly. "They'll remain with the Morrison family unless suitable relatives come forward. The state prefers placement with family members when possible." Maria looked at me carefully. "Since you're their grandmother, you would have first consideration if you're interested in applying for custody." The irony wasn't lost on me. 3 months ago, David and Jessica had tried to dump their children on me while they fled their responsibilities. I'd refused on principle I wouldn't enable their abandonment. Now they were in jail, and the state was asking if I wanted the children they'd discarded. "What about the conservatorship attempt?" I asked. "Wouldn't that affect my eligibility?" Maria actually smiled. "Actually, the court's findings work in your favor. Judge Wells specifically noted your mental acuity and sound judgment in her ruling. Combined with the criminal charges against your son, it paints a clear picture of who the responsible adult is in this situation." After Maria left, I sat in Frank's old chair and tried to process everything. David wasn't just financially irresponsible or emotionally manipulative. He was an actual criminal who'd been stealing from his employers. Every mortgage payment I'd made hadn't helped struggling young parents. It had funded a criminal enterprise. My generosity had literally been financing theft. How had I missed the signs? The vague explanations about slow business while they wore designer clothes and took expensive vacations. The mysterious storage unit I'd seen on a bank statement once. The way David always seemed nervous when discussing work. I'd been so focused on being a good mother, a supportive grandmother, that I'd ignored obvious red flags. But that was the old Maggie. The new Maggie was going to make different choices. The next morning I called Sarah Blackwood and scheduled an appointment to discuss custody proceedings. Then I called the Morrison family and asked if I could visit Tyler and Chloe that weekend. The Morrison house was a comfortable 2-story colonial in a quiet neighborhood with toys scattered across the front yard and children's artwork covering the refrigerator. Linda Morrison, a warm woman in her 40s with laugh lines around her eyes, greeted me with genuine kindness. "Mrs. Sullivan, the children will be so excited to see you. They talk about you constantly." Tyler and Chloe were playing a board game in the living room when I arrived. Both children looked healthier than they had in months. Tyler had gained weight, filling out his too thin frame. Chloe's perpetual anxiety seemed to have faded, replaced with something that looked almost like peace. "Grandma Maggie." Chloe launched herself into my arms with enthusiasm I hadn't seen since she was very young, before Jessica had taught her that I was a burden. "Hey, kiddo," I hugged her tight, breathing in her strawberry shampoo. "How are you settling in here?" "It's really good." She pulled back, her face bright. "Linda makes pancakes every Saturday and Tom helps me with my math homework. And guess what? I'm not scared all the time anymore." The casual mention of fear caught my attention. "Scared of what, sweetheart?" "Mom and Dad fighting about money, and mean people calling the house yelling at Dad. Sometimes Dad would get really angry and throw things." She said it matter-of-factly like it was normal. "But it's quiet here. Peaceful quiet, not scary quiet." Tyler nodded from across the room, his board game forgotten. "Mom used to cry a lot when she thought we couldn't hear. And Dad was always on the phone with people who made him mad. We never knew when he was going to explode about something." These children had been living with far more stress and dysfunction than I'd realized. David and Jessica's money problems weren't just about poor budgeting. They'd been creating a genuinely unstable, frightening environment for their kids. I spent 3 hours at the Morrison house that afternoon. Linda and Tom were everything foster parents should be: patient, kind, structured. They'd created a home where Tyler and Chloe felt safe for the first time in years. By the time I left, 2 things were crystal clear. First, Tyler and Chloe were thriving in a stable environment. They deserved to stay in that stability, not be yanked around by adults who couldn't get their lives together. Second, they deserved grandparents who would put their welfare above everything else, including pride, including past hurts, including the principle of not enabling their parents' bad behavior. Their parents were gone now, facing years in prison for their crimes. The question of enabling them was moot, but these children needed someone who loved them unconditionally, who would show up for school plays and help with homework and make sure they knew they were valued, not burdens. That evening I called Sarah Blackwood. "I want to file for custody," I told her without preamble. There was a pause. "Mrs. Sullivan, are you sure taking on 2 children at your age is a significant commitment?" "Sarah, those children have been failed by every adult in their lives, including me." My voice was steady, certain. "I failed them when I refused to take them in before. I won't make that mistake again." "This is different from temporary emergency care," she cautioned. "This would be permanent legal guardianship, possibly adoption. School events, teenage drama, college applications, everything that comes with full-time parenting. Are you prepared for that?" I looked around my quiet house. The spare bedrooms gathering dust. The big kitchen table that seated 8 but only fed 1. The garden that could easily accommodate a swing set and sandbox. "I'm 67 years old, Sarah. I'm healthy, financially stable, and I just spent 3 months learning exactly how much backbone I have when people try to take advantage of me. I think I can handle 2 children who actually deserve my help." "Then let's get started on the paperwork." The custody process would take months, but I wasn't worried about the outcome. I had excellent legal representation, a clean record, and most importantly, I was fighting for something worthwhile instead of against people who'd betrayed me. For the first time since this whole mess started, I was moving towards something positive instead of just away from something negative. But first, I had a house to transform and a life to redesign. Because being a full-time grandmother at 67 was going to require some serious planning. The old Maggie might have been intimidated by such a massive life change. The new Maggie was already shopping for bunk beds online. The custody hearing was scheduled for December 15th, exactly 6 months after David and Jessica had driven away from their children without looking back. I arrived at the courthouse wearing my navy suit, the same one I'd worn to Jessica's birthday dinner where this whole journey had started. But I'd paired it with a different necklace today. Not Frank's pearls, but a simple silver chain Tyler had given me for my birthday 3 years ago. A reminder of what I was fighting for. Tyler and Chloe sat with Maria Santos in the front row, both dressed in their Sunday best and looking nervous but hopeful. Over the past 4 months, they'd been visiting my house every weekend, slowly settling into routines that felt natural and right. Saturday morning pancakes, my specialty blueberry with real maple syrup. Sunday afternoon gardening where Chloe had discovered she had her grandmother's green thumb. Homework at the kitchen table while I made dinner. Tyler teaching me how to play his video games while I taught him how to make my famous pot roast. Small moments that had stitched us back together, thread by thread. Sarah Blackwood sat beside me with her briefcase, looking confident and prepared. In front of her was a folder thick with character references, financial statements, home inspection reports, and a detailed parenting plan we'd developed with help from a family counselor. Judge Patricia Wells presided over this hearing too, and I took her presence as a positive sign. She already knew our family history. She'd seen firsthand how David and Jessica operated. Mrs. Sullivan, Judge Wells, began looking at me over her reading glasses. You're petitioning for permanent custody of your grandchildren following their parents' incarceration and voluntary termination of parental rights. This is a significant responsibility for anyone, let alone someone approaching 70. Why do you believe this is the right decision? I stood up, my legs steady despite the nerves fluttering in my stomach. Your Honor, I raised one child already. Clearly I made some mistakes given how he turned out. A small chuckle rippled through the courtroom. But I believe I've learned from those mistakes. I know now that love without boundaries isn't love at all, it's enabling. I know that respect has to be earned and maintained, not assumed because of blood. And I know that Tyler and Chloe deserve a home where they feel safe, valued, and loved unconditionally. Judge Wells made a note on her legal pad. Continue. For the past 4 months, these children have been thriving. Tyler's grades have improved from C's and D's to A's and B's. Chloe no longer has the anxiety attacks that used to wake her up at night. They smile more. They laugh more. They're becoming the children they were always meant to be before their parents' dysfunction stole their childhood. I glanced at Tyler and Chloe. They were watching me with absolute trust in their eyes. I'm not perfect, Your Honor. I'm 67 years old with arthritis in my knees and reading glasses I can never find. But I have time, patience, financial stability, and more love than I know what to do with. Those children need someone who will show up every single day no matter what. I can be that person. The hearing proceeded smoothly after that. Sarah presented evidence of my financial stability, my pension, Frank's life insurance, the modest but comfortable savings I'd accumulated, my physical and mental health records showing I was in excellent condition for my age, the home inspection report confirming my house was safe and suitable for children. The social worker reports were glowing. Maria Santos testified that in her 8 years with Child Protective Services, she'd rarely seen such a dramatic positive change in children's well-being. Then Linda Morrison requested to speak on my behalf. Your Honor, my husband and I have been foster parents for 8 years. We've cared for dozens of children, and we understand what healthy family dynamics look like. Linda's voice was steady professional. Tyler and Chloe have done wonderfully in our care, but they've absolutely flourished during their visits with Mrs. Sullivan. The bond between them is beautiful and genuine. She provides exactly the combination of structure, affection, and stability these children need. But the moment that sealed everything came when Tyler asked to speak. He stood up, all 12 years of him trying to look grown up and serious. Judge Wells smiled gently and nodded for him to approach. Your Honor, I know Grandma Maggie is old. Tyler's voice cracked slightly. She says so herself all the time. But she's the only adult who's ever kept her promises to us. She says she'll pick us up from school and she's there 15 minutes early. She says she'll help with homework and she sits with us until we understand it. She says she loves us and we actually believe her. He glanced back at Chloe, who was wiping tears from her eyes. Our parents said they loved us too, but then they left. They chose running away over us. Grandma Maggie chose us even when it was hard. Even when we didn't deserve it. I want to live with her. Not just for now, forever. There wasn't a dry eye in the courtroom. Judge Wells reviewed her notes for what felt like an eternity. Then she looked up, and I saw the decision in her face before she spoke. Based on the evidence presented and the clear best interests of these children, I grant permanent custody of Tyler and Chloe Sullivan to their grandmother Margaret Sullivan, effective immediately. The gavel fell, and suddenly I was responsible for 2 children again at 67 years old. Tyler and Chloe rushed toward me, and I pulled them both into a hug that felt like coming home. Behind me, I heard Sarah quietly congratulating the social workers. Linda Morrison was smiling through her tears. Thank you, I whispered into Tyler's hair. Thank you for giving me another chance. Thank you for not giving up on us, he whispered back. The transition happened faster than I expected. Within a week, Tyler and Chloe had moved into my house permanently. Tyler claimed the larger spare bedroom, which we'd painted a deep blue at his request. We furnished it with a sturdy desk for homework bookshelves for his growing collection of science fiction novels and a comfortable reading chair where he could escape into other worlds. The posters on his walls were of NASA missions and theoretical physics equations. My grandson, it turned out, was brilliant when given the chance to focus without constant chaos. Chloe took the smaller bedroom, which became an explosion of pink and yellow sunshine. We covered one wall with corkboard where she could pin up her artwork, and there was a lot of it. Turns out my granddaughter had inherited more than just my green thumb. She had an artist's eye, seeing beauty in ordinary things. Her drawings of our garden were so detailed, so full of life, that I had several framed and hung in the hallway. The first few weeks were chaotic in ways I hadn't anticipated. I'd forgotten how loud children could be, how they could turn a simple trip to the grocery store into a 45-minute negotiation about which cereal was acceptable, how they needed reminding to brush their teeth, pick up their clothes, do their homework, feed the cat I hadn't planned on adopting, but somehow now had. Her name was Whiskers, and Chloe had found her hiding under the porch 2 weeks after moving in. A scraggly orange kitten with one bent ear and eyes that had seen too much of the world's cruelty. "She's just like us, Grandma," Chloe had said, cradling the terrified kitten. "She needs someone to love her." How could I say no to that? But it was good chaos, purposeful chaos, the kind that filled my house with laughter and noise and life. I'd forgotten what it felt like to be needed for something real, not for money, for presence, for showing up, for being the steady, reliable constant in someone's world. The biggest surprise was how much I enjoyed it. Helping Tyler with algebra homework, watching his face light up when he finally understood a concept. Listening to Chloe practice piano, she'd begged for lessons, and I'd found a wonderful teacher 2 streets over. Attending parent-teacher conferences and actually getting to brag about my grandchildren's achievements instead of making excuses for their parents' absence. We established routines that became traditions. Saturday morning pancakes with whatever toppings they wanted. Blueberries for Tyler, chocolate chips for Chloe, plain with butter for me. Sunday afternoon gardening. Chloe had her own section of the rose garden now where she was growing sunflowers that were already taller than she was. Wednesday evening game nights where Tyler taught me increasingly complex board games, and I taught them the card games Frank and I used to play. Thursday pizza and movie nights, taking turns choosing the film. I was working my way through their favorite animated movies while they gamely sat through my classic musicals. The house that had been so quiet after Frank died was alive again, full of backpacks in the hallway and shoes by the door, and the blessed, beautiful noise of children who felt safe enough to just be children. But even as we settled into our new normal, I couldn't shake the feeling that David and Jessica's story wasn't finished. Prison sentences have end dates, and people who refuse to accept responsibility for their mistakes rarely learn from incarceration. They just get angrier, more resentful, more convinced that everyone else is to blame. I was right to be cautious. In February, I received a letter from Jessica written from county jail while she awaited sentencing. The letter was a masterpiece of manipulation. 4 pages of small, cramped handwriting full of excuses and justifications and veiled demands wrapped in the language of redemption. She was sorry for everything. Sorry they'd taken my money. Sorry they'd let Chloe be disrespectful. Sorry they'd tried to have me declared incompetent. But the circumstances had been so difficult. David's business partners had pressured him into illegal activities. She'd been suffering from untreated depression that clouded her judgment. They'd both been desperate and made terrible choices. But they were changing now, learning from their mistakes, going to therapy, finding faith, becoming better people. And when they got out, not if, but when they hoped I would support their reconciliation with Tyler and Chloe. After all, children need their parents. Blood is thicker than water. Families forgive and move forward. The subtext was clear. She expected me to facilitate their return to the children's lives. To step aside gracefully when they decided they wanted to play parent again. I read the letter 3 times, then showed it to Sarah Blackwood. "Standard manipulation," Sarah said, scanning the pages. "Notice how every apology comes with an excuse. How she frames their crimes as circumstantial rather than character-based. How she's already planning their return to the children's lives without any acknowledgement of the trauma they caused. What should I do? Nothing. Don't respond. If you engage, you're opening a door to ongoing manipulation." Sarah made notes in her legal pad. "I'll file a motion to ensure David and Jessica have no contact rights with the children upon release. We'll cite the abandonment, the criminal activity, and the ongoing instability." How long before they're released? With good behavior, David's looking at 2 to 3 years. Jessica, slightly less, 18 months to 2 years. But that's plenty of time to put strong legal protections in place. A week later, a letter arrived from David. His tone was different from Jessica's angrier, more accusatory. He blamed me for destroying his family, for poisoning his children against him, for refusing to help when he'd needed it most. If I had just continued the mortgage payments, none of this would have happened. The business wouldn't have failed, the contractors wouldn't have cornered him, he wouldn't have been forced into illegal activities to survive. Everything was my fault, and when he got out, he would make things right. He would reclaim his children and restore his family. I could either support that or be cut out of their lives entirely. My choice. The threatening tone was unmistakable. I showed this letter to Sarah as well, and she immediately filed for restraining orders. "Your son is demonstrating continued instability and potential danger," she said grimly. "This language, make things right. Reclaim his children, suggests he sees them as property, not people. Combined with his violent tendencies that Tyler and Chloe described, we need to protect you and the children now before he's released." That night I sat in the garden with a cup of tea, watching Tyler and Chloe chase fireflies across the lawn. They were laughing, their faces lit up by the glow of the fireflies they'd caught and released. Innocent, carefree, finally living the childhood they deserved. I'd moved mountains to give them this stability. I wasn't about to let their biological parents destroy it. David wanted to make things right. Perfect, because I had a few things to make right myself, and I'd learned a lot about strategic planning over the past year. The old Maggie had been reactive, responding to crises created by others. The new Maggie was going to be proactive, anticipating problems and solving them before they became threats. The call came on a Tuesday morning in March, just as I was making pancakes for Tyler and Chloe before school. "Mrs. Sullivan, this is Detective Jennifer Rodriguez from the Financial Crimes Unit. I need to ask you some questions about the mortgage payments you made for your son. We're investigating a much larger criminal network, and David's case has provided some unexpected leads." I flipped the last pancake and turned off the stove. "Detective, the children are about to leave for school. Can I call you back in 20 minutes? "Of course, this is important, but it can wait." After Tyler and Chloe left, backpacks, loaded lunches, packed Tyler, reminding Chloe about her art project due Friday, I called the detective back. She arrived an hour later with a thick file and a serious expression that reminded me of the IRS agents I'd seen in movies. Detective Rodriguez was a woman in her late 40s with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. She sat at my kitchen table accepting coffee while organizing documents that looked far more complex than simple theft charges. "Mrs. Sullivan, how much do you know about your son's construction work?" "Very little, apparently. I thought he was a project manager for a local company, but clearly I was wrong about most things concerning David. He did work for Morrison Construction, but not as a manager. He was an equipment operator with access to expensive machinery and tools." She spread photographs across my table. Construction sites, heavy machinery, warehouse facilities, shipping manifests with altered dates and signatures. "What we've discovered is that he wasn't just stealing equipment. He was part of an organized theft ring that's been operating for nearly 5 years. The scale of what she was describing made my head spin. "This operation was sophisticated," Detective Rodriguez continued. "They would steal equipment from job sites, alter serial numbers, and sell the machinery through fake companies in other states. David's role was identifying targets and providing inside information about security measures and delivery schedules." She showed me more photos. Invoices, bank transfers, email correspondence between David and people I'd never heard of. "How much money are we talking about?" I asked quietly. "Over $2 million in stolen equipment and fraudulent sales over 5 years. David wasn't a small-time thief, Mrs. Sullivan. He was a key player in a major criminal enterprise." I felt sick. For 2 years I'd been funding this. My mortgage payments hadn't supported a struggling family, they'd bankrolled organized crime. "Detective, am I in legal trouble for unknowingly financing criminal activity?" "No. You're clearly a victim of deception, not a willing participant. But we do need your cooperation in building the case against the larger network." She pulled out more documents. "Your son and Jessica were arrested in Las Vegas with stolen equipment. Faced with federal charges, David started talking, providing information about other participants in exchange for a reduced sentence." "Let me guess," I said bitterly. "He's minimizing his own role." "Exactly. He's claiming he was coerced by more senior members of the organization, portraying himself as a victim who got in over his head." She paused, her expression sympathetic. "Here's where it gets concerning for you personally. David claims his mother was a willing participant who knew exactly what the money was funding. My coffee cup slipped from my hands, shattering on the kitchen floor. Coffee spread across the tiles like an accusation. "He's trying to implicate me in his crimes," I whispered. "I'm afraid so. He's telling investigators that you were the mastermind behind the money laundering operation, using mortgage payments to disguise criminal proceeds." The betrayal was breathtaking. David wasn't just refusing to accept responsibility, he was actively trying to destroy me to save himself. "Detective Rodriguez, I have documented evidence of every financial transaction, every conversation, every interaction with David and Jessica. I can prove that I believed I was helping with legitimate household expenses." "We know. We've already reviewed your banking records and spoken with your attorney. Your story is consistent and well documented. But David's accusations mean you'll likely be called to testify in the federal trial." After the detective left, I cleaned up the broken coffee cup with shaking hands. Then I called Sarah Blackwood and scheduled an emergency meeting. But the real shock came that evening when Tyler approached me after dinner, his expression serious beyond his 13 years. "Mom, Maggie, there's something I need to tell you about Dad's work." I set down my dish towel and gave him my full attention. Over the past months, Tyler had started calling me Mom Maggie, a hybrid that honored both his biological mother's existence and my current role in his life. It made my heart swell every time. "What is it, sweetheart?" "Last summer before everything happened, I overheard Dad talking to some men in our garage. They were talking about stealing stuff and changing numbers on machines. I didn't understand it all, but I knew it was bad." My heart clenched. "Did you tell anyone at the time?" "I tried to tell Mom, but she said I was imagining things and told me never to repeat what I heard. She said it would get Dad in trouble with his boss." His voice was small, ashamed. "I should have told someone else. Maybe a teacher or Tyler, no." I pulled him into a hug. "You were a child. You tried to tell your mother and she silenced you. That's not your fault. But now I know what I heard was real. What they were doing was really wrong. And I need to tell the truth, even if it makes Dad look bad." I held him at arm's length, looking into eyes that were so much older than 13. "You're going to need to tell the police what you heard. It's important evidence in Dad's case. Are you ready for that?" He nodded solemnly. "I want to tell the truth. He made his own choices. I'm not going to lie to protect him." At 13 years old, Tyler already understood something his father had never learned: taking responsibility is more important than avoiding blame. That night after the children were in bed, I sat in Frank's old chair and realized something profound. David's attempt to implicate me had actually given me something valuable: absolute clarity about who he really was and what he was capable of. The old Maggie might have been heartbroken by her son's willingness to sacrifice her for his own benefit. The new Maggie was simply resolved to make sure his lies didn't succeed. Tomorrow I would start preparing for the fight of my life. Because if David thought he could destroy me to save himself, he was about to learn that some mothers become more dangerous when their children and now grandchildren are threatened, even when the threat comes from their own sons. The federal trial began on a hot Monday morning in September, exactly 1 year after David and Jessica had fled to Phoenix. I sat in the witness waiting room wearing my charcoal suit and reviewing the testimony I'd practiced with federal prosecutors for weeks. Tyler sat beside me now, 14 and 3 inches taller than last year. He'd gained weight, filled out, started to look like a young man instead of a frightened boy. Today he would testify against his own father. I'd never been prouder of his courage. "Mrs. Sullivan, you're up first," said Assistant U.S. Attorney Marcus Webb. He was a serious man in his 50s with graying temples and a reputation for never losing elder abuse cases. "Remember, just tell the truth clearly and let the evidence speak for itself." The courtroom was larger than I'd expected, filled with attorneys, defendants, investigators, and family members of various people involved in the conspiracy. David sat at the defendant's table wearing an orange jumpsuit, looking older than his 43 years. When our eyes met, his expression was cold, calculated, completely devoid of the warmth I remembered from his childhood. I took the oath and settled into the witness chair, looking directly at the jury as I'd been coached. 12 ordinary people who would decide whether David's lies about my involvement had any credibility. Prosecutor Webb began with basic questions: my relationship with David, the mortgage payments, my understanding of his employment situation. I answered clearly, honestly, providing dates, amounts, specific details about every transaction. "Mrs. Sullivan, did you ever knowingly provide money to fund criminal activity?" Absolutely not. I believed I was helping my son and daughter-in-law with legitimate household expenses during a difficult period. Did your son ever tell you he was involved in equipment theft or fraudulent sales? Never. He told me his construction business was slow and they were struggling to make mortgage payments. David's attorney stood for cross-examination. She was a sharp woman in her 50s who'd obviously been coached on how to make me appear complicit. Miss Sullivan, isn't it true that you asked very few questions about how your money was being used? I trusted my son to be honest with me. That was apparently a mistake. Didn't you find it suspicious that David needed exactly the same amount every month regardless of his claimed work situation? The mortgage payment was a fixed amount. That seemed perfectly reasonable. But you never verified that the money was actually going toward mortgage payments, did you? This was the moment I'd been preparing for. Actually, I did verify it. The defense attorney looked genuinely surprised. Excuse me. I reached into my purse and pulled out a manila folder, the same one I'd shown Judge Wells during the conservatorship hearing. In August, 2 months before I stopped making payments, I became concerned about David and Jessica's financial management, so I hired a private investigator to verify how my money was being used. A ripple of surprise went through the courtroom. This was new information for David's defense team. The investigator discovered that my money was not being used for mortgage payments. David and Jessica were using their own income for the mortgage and diverting my money to fund what appeared to be business expenses. I pulled out the investigator's report. Unexplained storage unit rentals, cash payments to unknown individuals, large deposits into accounts I'd never heard of. David's attorney recovered quickly. Why didn't you confront your son with this information? I planned to, but before I could arrange a meeting, my granddaughter publicly called me an old burden who smells like expired medicine at a family dinner, clearly repeating something she'd heard at home. That's when I realized my money had bought me nothing but contempt from people I thought I was helping. So you cut off payments out of hurt feelings. I cut off payments because the private investigator's report made it clear that David was lying about how my money was used. The disrespect from his family simply confirmed that continuing financial support would be throwing good money after bad. The prosecutor's redirect was brief and devastating. Mrs. Sullivan, when did you provide this investigative report to law enforcement? I gave it to Detective Rodriguez during her initial interview. It's been part of the evidence file for months. Checkmate. David's entire defense strategy had been based on claiming I was a knowing participant in money laundering, but I had documented proof that I'd investigated suspicious activity and discovered the deception myself. Tyler's testimony that afternoon was even more damaging. Speaking in a clear, steady voice, he described overhearing conversations about stolen equipment, altered serial numbers, and coordination with other criminal operators. Did your father ever ask you to keep these conversations secret? Prosecutor Webb asked. No, he didn't know I'd heard anything. But when I tried to tell my mother what I'd heard, she told me to forget about it and never repeat it to anyone. Did that seem strange to you? Yeah. If it was normal business stuff, why would she want to keep it secret? I knew something was wrong. David's attorney tried to discredit Tyler's testimony by claiming a child couldn't understand complex business conversations. But Tyler's responses were too detailed, too specific to dismiss. He described equipment models, mentioned specific dates, recalled conversations with an accuracy that came from being genuinely traumatized by what he'd witnessed. During a break, I watched David conferring frantically with his attorney. His confidence was cracking as his strategy collapsed around him. But the real bombshell came during the afternoon session when Prosecutor Webb called an unexpected witness, Detective Lisa Hammond from the Las Vegas Police Department. Detective Hammond, were you involved in the arrest of David and Jessica Sullivan? Yes, we stopped their vehicle during a routine traffic check and discovered it was loaded with stolen construction equipment. Did the defendants make any statements during their arrest? Detective Hammond consulted her notes. Mr. Sullivan immediately claimed the equipment belonged to his mother, who was financing his business operations. He said she knew about the theft and was planning to fence the equipment in Nevada. I felt the blood drain from my face. David had tried to frame me for his crimes from the very moment he was arrested. Did you find any evidence supporting Mr. Sullivan's claims about his mother's involvement? None whatsoever. Mrs. Sullivan was in her hometown at the time of the arrest, with multiple witnesses confirming her whereabouts. She had no connection to the stolen equipment beyond unknowingly providing money that funded the operation. David's face had gone completely white. He'd just been exposed as someone willing to destroy his own mother to escape responsibility for his crimes. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. David Sullivan guilty on all counts: federal conspiracy, interstate transportation of stolen goods, money laundering, perjury for lying about my involvement, 15 years in federal prison without possibility of parole for 8 years. Jessica received 12 years for her role in the conspiracy. The other members of the theft ring received sentences ranging from 8 to 20 years. Judge Morrison, a different judge from Judge Wells but equally stern, specifically noted David's attempts to implicate his innocent mother as evidence of his lack of remorse and unwillingness to accept responsibility. Mr. Sullivan, your willingness to destroy your own mother to avoid consequences demonstrates a moral bankruptcy that goes beyond your criminal acts. This court finds your behavior especially reprehensible. I felt no satisfaction watching my son led away in shackles, only profound sadness for the man he'd chosen to become, but also relief. Tyler and Chloe were safe from him, for at least 8 years, probably longer. 3 weeks after the verdict, I received a call from an attorney I didn't recognize. Mrs. Sullivan, this is Marcus Webb. I'm representing David's victims in a civil restitution case. I have some news that might interest you. He arrived at my house that afternoon with a briefcase full of documents and a story that would change everything I thought I knew about David's criminal career. Mrs. Sullivan, during the asset forfeiture process, we discovered something significant about your son's financial activities. Marcus spread documents across my dining room table. Bank statements, offshore account information, cryptocurrency wallets. What am I looking at? I asked. Your son wasn't just stealing equipment. Over 5 years, he was also running insurance fraud schemes, identity theft operations, and investment scams targeting elderly victims. He showed me more documents, lists of victims, fraudulent insurance claims, fake investment prospectuses. Over 5 years, David defrauded victims of more than $4 million. Elderly people who trusted him with their retirement savings. Small business owners who hired him for construction projects that never got completed. Insurance companies bilked with staged accidents. My stomach turned. How does this affect me? Marcus pulled out a specific set of documents. Under federal asset forfeiture laws, all proceeds from criminal activity must be returned to victims. But there's an interesting complication. He showed me a bank routing document that made my blood run cold. Your son opened multiple business accounts using your social security number and personal information. He forged your signature on loan applications, business registrations, and insurance policies. I stared at papers bearing my name on documents I'd never signed associated with companies I'd never heard of. Are you saying David stole my identity? Extensively. He used your excellent credit rating and clean financial history to establish credibility for his fraudulent operations. Several victims thought they were doing business with a reputable elderly woman, not a criminal in his 40s. The implications were staggering. David hadn't just taken my money and tried to frame me. He'd actively impersonated me to commit additional felonies. Am I liable for debts or legal problems created by this identity theft? No. You're clearly a victim, not a perpetrator. But here's where it gets interesting. Marcus pulled out another document. Under federal law, victims of identity theft can seek damages from the perpetrator's assets, even if those assets would otherwise go to other victims. What assets? David and Jessica lost everything. That's what everyone assumed. Marcus handed me a financial statement. But financial investigators discovered that David had been hiding money in offshore accounts and cryptocurrency investments that Jessica didn't even know about. The number on the page made my jaw drop. David accumulated nearly $1.8 million in hidden assets over 5 years of criminal activity, money he was planning to access after his eventual release from prison. And as a victim of his identity theft crimes, you have legal standing to claim those assets as compensation for the damage to your credit reputation and emotional distress. Given the extent of his fraud using your identity, you could potentially claim the entire amount. I sat back in my chair processing this information. David had not only stolen from strangers and tried to frame me, he'd systematically used my identity to commit additional felonies while hiding nearly $2 million for his own future benefit. What would happen to that money if I don't claim it? It would be distributed among his other victims, which is certainly just, but it wouldn't address the specific harm done to you through identity theft. I thought about Tyler and Chloe, now 15 and 11, who would need college funding in a few years. I thought about the elderly victims David had defrauded, people like me who'd trusted someone they shouldn't have. I thought about the life David had stolen from his own children by choosing crime over responsibility. Marcus, I want to claim half the assets for my grandchildren's college futures. The other half should go to David's other victims, particularly the elderly ones who lost retirement money. Marcus smiled approvingly. That seems like a fair and generous solution, Mrs. Sullivan. The legal process took 6 months to complete, but eventually I received a check for $900,000 in restitution for identity theft damages. I put $800,000 into trust funds for Tyler and Chloe's education, $400,000 each with careful stipulations about how it could be used. The remaining $100,000 went into a fund for their other needs as they grew up. The other $900,000 was distributed among David's victims, helping restore at least some of what he'd stolen from them. On the anniversary of David and Jessica's sentencing, I sat in my garden with Tyler and Chloe watching them work on homework under the old oak tree Frank had planted 30 years ago. Tyler was studying for his SATs, already planning for college with the confidence of a young man who knew his future was secure. He wanted to study engineering at MIT. With his trust fund and his brilliant mind, that dream was absolutely achievable. Chloe was practicing piano, preparing for her first recital next month. She'd discovered a love for music that brought her peace in a way nothing else did. Her art still covered our walls, but music had become her primary passion. They were good kids who'd survived terrible parents and emerged stronger rather than broken. They understood the value of honesty, responsibility, and hard work because they'd seen what happens when people choose differently. "Mom, Maggie," Chloe said, looking up from her music, "do you think Dad will try to contact us when he gets out of prison?" It was a question I'd been expecting. David would be eligible for parole when Tyler was 26 and Chloe was 23, both adults capable of making their own decisions. "He might try," I said honestly, "but by then you'll be adults who can decide for yourselves what kind of people you want in your lives." Tyler closed his textbook and looked at me seriously. I hope he's learned something from all this. But if he hasn't, I don't want him around our families when we have kids someday. I don't want my children to learn the wrong lessons about what family means. At 16, Tyler already understood what David had never learned. Family isn't about blood or obligation. It's about people who support, respect, and care for each other through good times and bad. As the sun set over my garden painting, everything in shades of gold and crimson, I reflected on the unexpected journey that had brought us to this peaceful moment. 3 years ago, I'd been a lonely widow, being financially exploited by people who saw me as nothing more than a convenient ATM. Now I was surrounded by children who genuinely loved me, a future bright with possibilities and a sense of purpose I hadn't felt since Frank died. The roses in Frank's memorial garden bloomed magnificently that year, their perfume carrying on evening breezes that whispered promises of new beginnings and second chances. "You were right, honey," I said softly to Frank's memory. "I did have more backbone than I gave myself credit for." Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to enable destructive behavior, even when it means losing people you thought you couldn't live without. Sometimes setting boundaries saves not just yourself, but innocent people who deserve better from the adults who are supposed to protect them. David had taught me an important lesson without meaning to respect isn't something you owe people because of their relationship to you. It's something people earn through their actions and choices. The old Maggie had been a victim, allowing herself to be used because she confused enabling with love. The new Maggie was a survivor who'd learned the difference between being generous and being foolish, between being loving and being used. And that transformation, I realized, was worth every difficult step of the journey that had brought me home to myself and the family I was truly meant to protect. "What are you thinking about, Mom, Maggie?" Chloe asked, setting aside her music. I smiled at both of them, these children who'd given me purpose again, who'd taught me that it's never too late to start over, to set boundaries, to choose yourself. "I'm thinking about how grateful I am," I said simply. "For you, for this moment, for second chances." Tyler grinned. "We're grateful for you too, even if you do make us eat vegetables with every meal." "And limit screen time," Chloe added, but she was smiling. "Someone has to make sure you grow up right," I said. "I made mistakes with your father. I'm not making them with you." As darkness fell and we headed inside for dinner, pot roast Tyler's favorite, I took one last look at my garden, at the roses that had survived harsh winters, at the oak tree that had weathered countless storms, at the home that had been quiet for so long but was now filled with laughter and love. The cost of dignity, I'd learned, wasn't measured in money lost or relationships ended. It was measured in the courage to say no, to set boundaries, to choose self-respect over being used. And the rewards. Those were measured in moments like this, in children who felt safe, in a future built on honesty rather than manipulation, in knowing that when you finally find your backbone, you can use it to protect not just yourself, but the people who truly matter. David would spend the next 8 years minimum in prison thinking about the choices he'd made. I would spend those same years raising his children to be nothing like him, and honestly, that felt like justice.